Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Druids. They were the intellectual, spiritual, and judicial backbone of an entire civilization, wielding immense power across vast swathes of ancient Europe. Yet they left us almost nothing in their own words. No scrolls, no carved inscriptions, no treatises laying out their vast knowledge of the cosmos, law, or medicine. Imagine a society where the most educated, the most revered, the very shapers of culture deliberately chose an oral tradition so rigorous that it could take 2 decades to master, rather than committing their wisdom to ink or stone. This is the profound paradox at the heart of understanding the Druids. We know their name, the very word conjuring images of mistletoe, ancient oaks, and perhaps even Stonehenge. But the actual fabric of their lives, their beliefs, and their practices remains largely a tapestry woven from fragments and the often biased observations of their greatest antagonists, the Romans. Think about this for a second. Our primary sources on these enigmatic figures come from men like Julius Caesar, who had a vested interest in portraying the Gauls and Britons as barbaric and in need of Roman civilization, or Pliny the Elder, writing centuries later, whose accounts are often coloured by Roman fascination and misunderstanding. How much of what we think we know about the Druids is a reflection of Roman propaganda or cultural bias? And how much is genuine insight into these powerful, secretive figures? This fundamental contradiction, the immense influence of the Druids versus the near-total silence of their own voices, is what makes their history so endlessly fascinating and so crucial to understanding the ancient world that King Arthur would one day inhabit. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. So, who exactly were these powerful, secretive figures that presided over the spiritual, legal, and educational life of the ancient Celts? The very word Druid itself is debated, but many scholars believe it derives from a Proto-Celtic root meaning oak knower, or one who has great knowledge, perhaps linking them to the sacred oak groves where they conducted their rites. They weren't just priests. Their role was far more expansive, encompassing functions that we would today divide among judges, teachers, philosophers, healers, and even political advisors to chieftains and kings. Julius Caesar, in his Commentary de Bello Gallico, his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, provides one of the most detailed, if problematic, early accounts. He tells us that the Druids quote Druidic, and that their decisions were binding, with those who defied them being excommunicated from society, a fate considered worse than death. Their influence wasn't confined to one region. Druids were found across Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, acting as a pan-Celtic intellectual and spiritual elite. They stood above the warrior class in social hierarchy, often exempt from military service and taxation, a testament to their revered status. Imagine a society where the spiritual leaders held such sway that even the most formidable chieftain deferred to their judgment. They were the keepers of tradition, the arbiters of justice, and the living encyclopedias of their culture, all without a single written word of their own doctrine. This insistence on oral transmission wasn't merely a technological limitation. It was a deliberate choice, intended to preserve the sanctity and secrecy of their knowledge, making it accessible only to the initiated and ensuring its power remained concentrated. This commitment to oral tradition meant that a druid's training was extraordinarily rigorous and lengthy, often lasting 20 years. During this period, students would memorize vast quantities of verses, laws, historical lore, and philosophical teachings. Think about the sheer cognitive load involved. Entire legal codes, complex astronomical observations, detailed genealogies, and profound theological concepts, all committed to memory without the aid of a single textbook. This wasn't just rote learning, it was a deep immersion that reshaped their minds, connecting them intimately with the flow of tradition. Their sacred spaces were not grand stone temples like those of the Romans or Greeks, but rather natural settings, dense oak groves or nematons, where the veil between worlds was believed to be thin. Here, amid ancient trees and often beside natural springs or rivers, they conducted their ceremonies, connecting the earthly realm with the celestial cycles they meticulously observed. It's within these groves that we encounter one of the most famous and perhaps most exaggerated druidic practices, the ritual harvesting of mistletoe. Pliny the Elder, writing as the 1st century CE, describes druids in white robes using a golden sickle to cut mistletoe from a sacred oak, catching it in a white cloth before it touched the ground. While this image is iconic, its historical accuracy is debated, likely a romanticized account by a Roman keen on exoticizing foreign cultures. More controversially, Caesar and other Roman writers describe human sacrifice, often on a grand scale, as part of druidic rituals, particularly to appease deities during times of war or plague. Modern historians largely agree that some form of human sacrifice likely occurred in Celtic societies, but the sensationalized scale reported by the Romans might have been inflated to justify Roman conquest and suppression. What is clear is their deep connection to the natural world, their belief in the transmigration of souls, that the soul passed from one body to another after death, and their profound understanding of the seasons and celestial movements which informed their agricultural practices and religious festivals. This clash of cultures between the Druids and the encroaching Roman Empire was inevitable. Rome, with its centralized authority, written laws, and monumental stone temples, saw the Druids as a direct threat. Their immense influence over Celtic populations, their fierce independence, and their role in inciting resistance against Roman rule made them prime targets for suppression. The Roman general Suetonius Paulinus, for instance, launched a brutal campaign against the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, in 60 CE, which Tacitus graphically describes as encountering a line of warriors with women acting like furies in black attire and with dishevelled hair waving torches. Behind them stood the Druids, uttering dire imprecations with their hands uplifted to heaven. The Romans, unnerved but resolute, massacred the defenders, cut down their sacred groves, and destroyed their altars. This wasn't just military conquest. It was a deliberate assault on the spiritual heart of Celtic resistance. The Roman suppression of the Druids fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of Britain. Their power waned, their influence diminished, and their practices were either driven underground or assimilated into new forms. The direct lineage of the great oak knowers was broken, their oral traditions fractured, and their public authority dismantled. But the ideas they nurtured, the reverence for the land, the sense of an interconnected spiritual world, did not simply vanish. These deep-seated beliefs continued to echo through the landscape, subtly shaping the minds of the people, even as new spiritual currents began to flow into Britain. And it is into this spiritual vacuum, this land still whispering with the memory of ancient groves and powerful unseen forces, that we will turn in our next chapter. We'll explore the twilight of pagan Britain and the slow, inexorable rise of a new religion that would eventually lay the groundwork for the legends of a king who would become the very embodiment of Britain's mythical past. Arthur. Welcome back, fellow travellers through the mist of time. In our last exploration, we witnessed the brutal, systematic dismantling of the Druidic order by the Iron Fist of Rome, culminating in the devastating campaign on Mona. We saw how a civilization's spiritual and intellectual backbone was shattered, its sacred groves razed, its lineage of oral tradition severed. But what truly happens when such a profound spiritual authority, one so deeply interwoven with the very fabric of society, is violently ripped away? Does it simply vanish, like smoke on the wind? Or does it leave an indelible mark, a spiritual vacuum that nothing can truly fill, yet everything rushes to occupy? Imagine, if you will, the aftermath of Mona. The chilling silence after the screams, the acrid scent of burning oak and human sacrifice mingling with the sea air. Suetonius Paulinus and his legions had achieved their objective. The physical manifestation of druidic power was broken. The revered teachers, judges and healers, those who had kept the vast lore of their people alive for centuries through rigorous oral tradition, were scattered, silenced, or slaughtered. A profound silence descended upon the Celtic lands, a silence where once the wisdom of the Druids echoed through the Nemetons, guiding kings and commoners alike. But here's the paradox, isn't it? While the structure of Druidism was destroyed, the spirit of the land, the deep-seated reverence for nature, for the sacred groves, for the interconnectedness of all life, these were not so easily eradicated. How could they be? They were not doctrines written on scrolls, but beliefs etched into the very soul of the people, passed down through generations, ingrained in their daily lives, their understanding of the world. The destruction of the Druids left a gaping wound, a spiritual void that cried out to be filled, and into this void, slowly but inexorably, began to seep a new, profoundly different spiritual current: Christianity. Think about this seismic shift. For centuries the Celts had worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, revered ancestors, and believed in the transmigration of souls, seeing the divine manifest in every tree, every river, every stone. Their spiritual leaders were not just priests but philosophers, scientists and lawgivers, deeply connected to the cycles of nature and the unseen realms. Now, with the Druids gone, the people were left adrift. The Romans, ever practical, sought to replace Celtic traditions with their own imperial cults and state-sanctioned deities, but these foreign gods never truly took root in the same way. Roman temples rose, Roman laws were enforced, but the underlying spiritual currents of the land remained untamed, waiting. It is into this turbulent post-Druidic landscape that Christianity arrived in Roman Britain, not with the thunderous legions of Caesar, but often quietly, subtly, carried by traders, soldiers, and early missionaries. By the end of the 2nd century, there's evidence of Christian communities in Britain, though certainly not widespread. It was a religion of humble beginnings, often persecuted by the very Roman authorities who had suppressed the Druids. Yet, it offered something compelling in a world increasingly defined by Roman might and the loss of ancient certainties, a promise of salvation, a universal brotherhood, and a single, all-powerful God. Consider the stark contrast between these two spiritual systems. Druidism, with its decentralized nature-centric practices, its emphasis on oral tradition, and a priesthood trained for decades in secret law, its cyclical view of time and reincarnation. And then Christianity, monotheistic, centered on a historical figure and a written scripture, organized into a hierarchical church structure, offering linear salvation and an afterlife distinct from the earthly realm. On the surface, they seem utterly incompatible. Yet history is rarely so straightforward. As Christianity slowly gained traction, particularly after Emperor Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century and its eventual adoption as the official religion of the Roman Empire, it began to spread more widely across Britain. And what do we see? We see a fascinating process of adaptation and absorption. The early Christian missionaries, often astute observers of local customs, understood that simply eradicating deeply held beliefs was a near impossible task. Instead, they often sought to reinterpret, to overlay, to sanctify. Imagine a sacred oak grove, a nemeton, where Druids once performed their rituals. After the Roman conquest and the suppression, perhaps it lay desolate for a time, or perhaps folk memory still clung to its power. Then a Christian missionary arrives. Instead of destroying the site entirely, they might erect a cross within its bounds, or build a small chapel nearby. The sacred spring, once dedicated to a Celtic goddess, might be rededicated to a Christian saint. The feast days, tied to the agricultural calendar and ancient pagan rites, might be subtly shifted to coincide with Christian holidays. Think of the winter solstice, the darkest point of the year, a time of profound spiritual significance for the Celts, giving way to Christmas, celebrating the birth of the light of the world. This wasn't always a smooth, conscious transition, but a gradual organic process of syncretism, where old and new beliefs intertwined, creating a unique spiritual tapestry. This is what makes the spiritual landscape of post-Roman Britain so incredibly rich and complex. It's not simply a story of one religion replacing another. It's a story of echoes, of lingering presences. The Christian God was now paramount, but the ancient spirits of the land, the reverence for nature, the belief in fey folk, the power of wells and trees, these persisted in the collective consciousness, woven into folk tales, superstitions, and local practices. The veil between the worlds, so thin for the Druids, might have thickened, but it never fully closed. Then comes another monumental shift, the twilight of Roman Britain. By the early 5th century CE, the vast Roman Empire, stretched thin and assailed on all sides, began to withdraw its legions from distant provinces like Britannia. The official date often cited is 410 CE, when Emperor Honorius famously told the Britons to once quote 6. And just like that, the imperial superstructure, which had provided administration, military protection, and a semblance of order for nearly 4 centuries, vanished. This withdrawal created an immense power vacuum. Roman roads, villas, and towns remained, but the central authority was gone. The Britons, accustomed to Roman governance and military might, were left vulnerable. They faced internal strife, warring factions vying for control, and perhaps most terrifyingly, external threats. The Picts from the north, who had always been a thorn in Rome's side, intensified their raids. But an even greater threat emerged from across the North Sea, the Anglo-Saxons. These Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, were drawn to the fertile lands of Britain, initially as mercenaries hired to defend against the Picts, but soon becoming conquerors themselves. They brought their own pagan gods, their own warlike traditions, and their own vision for the land. This period, often called the Dark Ages, was one of immense chaos, violence, and uncertainty. The remnants of Roman British culture struggled to survive, often retreating to fortified towns or remote strongholds. Christianity, which had begun to establish itself, faced new challenges, sometimes thriving in isolated monastic communities, other times struggling against the renewed paganism of the invaders. Imagine living through such a time. The world you knew is crumbling, the old protectors are gone, the new faith offers solace, but the land itself feels unsettled, haunted by the memory of its ancient guardians and threatened by new, brutal forces. In this crucible of cultural clash, spiritual transition, and existential threat, a desperate need arose for a leader, a figure who could unite the fractured peoples, stem the tide of invasion, and perhaps, in some way, embody the very spirit of Britain. This is the fertile ground, the spiritual and political crucible, from which the legends of King Arthur begin to emerge. He is not just a warlord or a historical figure. He is a symbol born from this specific historical moment. He is a Christian king, yes, but one whose stories are deeply rooted in a landscape still resonating with the echoes of druidic reverence for the land, a land where ancient magic and new faith would intertwine. His legends are a testament to the enduring power of myth, to the human need for heroes in times of profound darkness. The Druids, in their physical form, were gone, but their profound connection to the land, their understanding of its mystical currents, had subtly shaped the very ground upon which Arthur would rise. The stage is now set for a different kind of power, a different kind of magic to emerge from the heart of Britain. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention fully to this enigmatic figure, King Arthur, and begin to unravel how his legends, his knights, and his quest for Camelot are not just tales of chivalry, but are intrinsically linked to the spiritual legacy left behind by the Druids and forged in the tumultuous crucible of post-Roman Britain. We'll explore how the ancient reverence for the land, the lingering sense of magic, and the clash of pagan and Christian beliefs all coalesce to create one of the most enduring myths in Western civilization. Get ready to delve into the legendary world of swords, sorcery, and the enduring spirit of Britain. The Roman withdrawal in 410 CE, as we've discussed, didn't just leave a geopolitical vacuum. It created a spiritual and psychological abyss. Imagine, if you will, the sudden absence of the very structure that had governed daily life for centuries. The roads, the towns, the intricate administrative systems, all slowly began to fray, leaving a gaping wound in the heart of Britannia. This wasn't just a loss of governance, it was a loss of identity, a descent into what we now call the Dark Ages, a period shrouded in mist and uncertainty, where the flicker of written records often seems to vanish entirely. This was a time of desperate need. The land, once firmly under Roman sway, now echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of a people under siege. Pictish raiders descended from the north, Irish raiders harried the western coasts, and, most devastatingly, the Anglo-Saxons began their relentless incursions from the east. These were not just territorial disputes, they were existential threats, threatening to erase the very memory of what it meant to be British. In such an era of profound darkness, what does a people cling to? What provides solace, hope, and the inspiration to fight another day? It's here, in this crucible of chaos and despair, that the legends of King Arthur begin to take shape. Arthur, as we understand him today, is more than just a historical figure. He is a story, a powerful narrative born from the collective yearning for a hero. He represents the embodiment of resistance, the promise of order, and the enduring spirit of a land struggling to define itself amidst the ruins of an empire and the onslaught of new invaders. But how does a figure like Arthur emerge from such a period? And what does his legend owe to the spiritual landscape left behind by the Druids, a landscape subtly reshaped by the nascent Christian faith? This is where the threads of our story truly begin to intertwine. Think about the conditions that foster myth. When history is scarce, when the future is uncertain, and when the present is brutal, the human mind reaches for narratives that provide meaning. The tales of Arthur, whether rooted in a historical warlord or entirely fabricated, served this crucial purpose. They offered a vision of a united Britain, a beacon of chivalry and justice in an age of barbarism. And what's fascinating is how deeply these emerging legends drew upon the very essence of the land and its ancient spiritual heritage, even as they were increasingly framed within a Christian context. Let's consider the most obvious and perhaps most potent link to the druidic past, the figure of Merlin. Merlin, the enigmatic wizard, seer, and advisor to Arthur, is arguably the most direct echo of the Druids in the Arthurian cycle. He is a master of arcane knowledge, deeply connected to the natural world, capable of prophecy, and possessing an understanding of the cosmos that transcends ordinary human perception. Does this not sound remarkably like the Druids we've described? The philosophers, teachers, and spiritual guides who wielded immense power through their intellect and connection to the sacred. Merlin's wisdom is not derived from books, at least not in the conventional sense, but from an intimate understanding of the earth, the stars, and the unseen forces that govern existence. He lives in caves, converses with spirits, and manipulates the very fabric of reality. He is often depicted as a wild man, a hermit of the forest, embodying a primal connection to the land that resonates with the druidic reverence for nature. He bridges the gap between the earthly and the otherworldly, a role not dissimilar to the Druids who were believed to mediate between gods and mortals, and to understand the veil between worlds. In many ways, Merlin embodies the lingering power of the ancient ways, a spiritual force that the Roman legions could not extinguish, only drive underground. He is the last great practitioner of a wisdom tradition that predates the cross, a bridge from the pagan past to the Christian future. But Merlin is not the only thread connecting Arthur's world to the druidic legacy. Consider the very landscape of Arthurian legend, the deep enchanted forests where knights embark on perilous quests, the mysterious lakes from which magical swords emerge, the ancient stone circles and burial mounds that dot the landscape, these are not mere backdrops. They are active participants in the narrative, imbued with their own power and mystery. This reflects a profound reverence for the land itself, a spiritual connection that runs deep in Celtic culture and was central to druidic belief. Remember how the Druids regarded nemetons, sacred groves, and natural springs as hallowed sites. That sense of the divine residing within nature, within specific trees or bodies of water, persists in the Arthurian tales. The Lady of the Lake, for instance, is a powerful otherworldly figure tied directly to a body of water, a concept that speaks volumes about the enduring sanctity of natural places. These aren't just pretty scenes. They are places where the mundane world touches the magical, where the veil between what we perceive and what lies beyond thins. This is a direct inheritance from a worldview where every stream, every ancient tree, every hill held spiritual significance, a worldview carefully cultivated by the Druids. Then there's Avalon, the mythical island where Arthur is taken to heal after his final battle, a place shrouded in mist and mystery, often described as an island of apples. Avalon is a clear echo of the Celtic otherworld, a paradise, a realm beyond human ken where time operates differently and magic is inherent. This concept of a separate magical realm, accessible under specific circumstances and populated by powerful beings, is deeply rooted in pre-Christian Celtic mythology. The Druids, with their belief in the transmigration of souls and their understanding of the cyclical nature of existence, would have been intimately familiar with such concepts. Avalon serves as Arthur's final resting place, a gateway to a spiritual dimension, suggesting a continuity of belief in an existence beyond death, albeit one now tinged with a Christian hope of resurrection. Yet, as Christianity gradually solidified its hold in Britain, the legends of Arthur underwent a fascinating process of syncretism. The monks and scribes who began to record and disseminate these oral traditions were, naturally, Christians. They shaped the narratives to align with their own worldview, transforming Arthur from a potentially pagan warlord into a quintessential Christian king, a defender of the faith against pagan Saxons. The most striking example of this is the integration of the Holy Grail into the Arthurian cycle. The Grail, a sacred chalice said to have been used by Christ at the Last Supper and later to catch his blood, is an unequivocally Christian symbol, but its quest, the arduous search for a mystical object that grants spiritual enlightenment and healing, bears a striking resemblance to ancient Celtic quest narratives. Think of the cauldrons of plenty, or the magical cups found in earlier Celtic myths. The Grail narrative, with its trials and spiritual purification, essentially grafted a Christian framework onto a pre-existing Celtic narrative structure of heroic quests for sacred life-giving artifacts. It's a brilliant example of how the new faith absorbed and reinterpreted older spiritual motifs, allowing for a continuity of storytelling while subtly shifting its theological emphasis. Arthur, therefore, becomes a complex figure, a king who embodies the martial prowess and earthy wisdom of his ancestors, yet who is also a devout Christian, leading his knights on a quest for the ultimate Christian relic. His court at Camelot, though often romanticized as a bastion of chivalry, can be seen as an idealized attempt to establish order and justice in a world still reeling from chaos, a vision of what a truly righteous kingdom could be. This vision, while distinctly Christian, nonetheless carried echoes of the druidic emphasis on justice, wisdom, and the well-being of the community. The challenge, as always, is separating the historical kernel from the legendary husk. Was there a historical Arthur? Scholars continue to debate this fiercely. Early sources like Gildas's De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written in the 6th century, mention a great British victory at the Battle of Baden, but not the name Arthur. Later Welsh annals and histories begin to name him, usually as a military leader, a dux bellorum, a battle leader, rather than a king. The embellishments, the magic, the knights, the round table, Excalibur, Merlin and the Grail all come much later, layered on by generations of storytellers, poets and chroniclers. Yet for our purposes, the historical authenticity of a single individual named Arthur is less important than the profound impact of the legend. Regardless of whether a real King Arthur ever united Britain against the Saxons, the story of King Arthur did. It provided a powerful narrative of resilience, a foundational myth for a people struggling to maintain their identity. It spoke to a deep-seated desire for a golden age, a time when heroes walked the earth and justice prevailed. What is clear is that these legends, born in the twilight of pagan Britain and nurtured by the nascent Christian faith, drew heavily on the spiritual wellsprings of the land, the druidic understanding of nature's sanctity, the belief in another world, the reverence for ancient wisdom. All these elements found new expression in the tales of Arthur and his court. They were not explicit resurrections of Druidism, but rather the subtle, enduring echoes of a spiritual tradition that had been suppressed but never entirely eradicated. The spirit of the land, imbued with centuries of Druidic reverence, continued to shape the imagination of its inhabitants. So when we look at Arthurian legend, we are not just seeing tales of knights and magic. We are witnessing the complex interplay of history, memory, and belief. We see how the spiritual legacy of the Druids, though forced into the shadows, continued to exert a profound influence on the emerging cultural identity of Britain, subtly informing the stories that would define its future. This enduring power of myth, the ability of narratives to shape a people's understanding of themselves and their past, is what makes the Arthurian cycle so compelling. It's a tapestry woven from fragments of truth, wishful thinking, and the deep, resonant spirituality of a land that refused to forget its ancient magic. As Britain moved from the chaos of the Dark Ages into the early medieval period, these legends would continue to evolve, becoming richer and more intricate with each retelling. This stage is now set for us to delve deeper into these specific tales, to explore how they were transmitted, transformed, and ultimately came to define an entire era. We'll explore the specific characters, the iconic artifacts, and the enduring themes that continue to captivate us, all while keeping a keen eye on the subtle yet powerful influence of those ancient spiritual guardians, the Druids, who laid the groundwork for so much of what we consider quintessentially British. The story emphasizes that the historical authenticity of Arthur is less important than the legend's profound impact as a foundational myth for a people struggling to define their identity, continually shaped by the subtle yet powerful influence of the suppressed Druidic spiritual tradition. And this, dear reader, brings us to a crucial point. How does a quotes spiritual tradition continue to exert a quote 9 reading? If the Druids, as an organised priesthood were shattered by Roman might, how could their legacy persist, shaping the very bedrock of a nation's identity centuries later? The answer lies in the deep, resilient undercurrent of belief that flows beneath the surface of official histories and religious conversions, a spiritual aquifer that, once tapped, continues to nourish the cultural landscape for generations. Imagine, if you will, a vast forest. The Romans, like a conquering army, swept through, felling the mightiest trees, the ancient oaks that symbolized the Druids' power and wisdom. They burned the sacred groves, dispersed the priests, and imposed their own imperial order, their own gods, and eventually their own monotheistic faith. From the outside, it would appear the forest was gone, replaced by neat Roman roads and burgeoning Christian basilicas. But beneath the scorched earth, the roots remained. The seeds lay dormant, waiting for the right conditions to sprout anew. This is the paradox we grapple with. The Druids, as a formal institution, were broken. Their schools, their councils, their very lineage as an organised priesthood were devastated. Yet, the spirit of their beliefs, the profound connection to the land, the reverence for natural forces, the understanding of the cyclical nature of life and death, and the belief in another world, these were not things that could be eradicated by a legionnaire's sword or a bishop's decree. These were woven into the very fabric of Celtic consciousness, passed down not through formal lessons in nemetons, but through fireside stories, local customs, herbal remedies, and the unspoken awe inspired by ancient landscapes. When the Roman legions finally withdrew from Britain in 410 CE, leaving the island to fend for itself in the face of relentless barbarian incursions, they left behind a spiritual vacuum that Christianity was still in the process of filling. But the seeds of the old ways, though buried, were far from dead. The chaos of the Quote 10 became a crucible, where desperate people, facing existential threats, often turned to whatever offered solace, power, or understanding, whether it was the newly established Christian church or the lingering echoes of ancient magic and wisdom. Consider the phenomenon of syncretism, which we touched upon earlier. This wasn't merely a top-down edict from Christian authorities to overlay new saints upon old gods. It was also an organic process, a cultural osmosis where the common people, deeply steeped in pre-Christian reverence for specific places or practices, simply continued their traditions under a new guise. A sacred spring once dedicated to a local goddess did not suddenly lose its sanctity because a priest blessed it. Instead, it became a holy well associated with a Christian saint, its healing properties attributed to the new faith, but its primal power, its genius loci, remained undeniably ancient. Think of the countless examples across Britain and Ireland, the veneration of trees, particularly oaks, which continued long after their official druidic significance was condemned. The belief in the protective or malevolent spirits of specific groves, hills, and rivers, the seasonal festivals like Samhain, All Hallows' Eve, and Beltane, May Day, which, though given Christian names and narratives, retained their deep-seated pagan roots, marking the turning of the agricultural year, the thinning of the veil between worlds, and the celebration of fertility and harvest. These were not Druids practicing their rites, but people observing customs whose origins were so ancient, so deeply ingrained, that they felt simply right. This enduring reverence for the land, for the spirits that resided within it, and for the wisdom embedded in nature itself, is what truly forms the bridge between the suppressed druidic tradition and the world of King Arthur. The Druids taught that the world was alive, imbued with spirit, and that the veil between the mundane and the magical was thin, particularly in certain sacred places. This concept, far from disappearing, simply morphed. It became the enchanted forests where knights encountered mythical beasts, the mysterious lakes from which magical swords emerged, and the misty islands that served as gateways to the other world. And who better embodies this enduring legacy than Merlin himself? He is the quintessential bridge figure, a man born of mysterious parentage, often depicted with a primal, almost wild connection to nature. Merlin is not a Christian saint. He is a wizard, a seer, a prophet whose wisdom comes not from scripture alone, but from an intimate understanding of the earth, the stars, and the ancient currents of magic that flow through the land. His prophecies echo the druidic practice of divination. His knowledge of herbs and healing aligns with their role as physicians. His counsel to kings reflects their position as advisors and educators. In many ways, Merlin is the literary manifestation of the last Druid, not in the sense of being a formal priest of the old order, for that order had vanished, but as a living repository of the ancient arcane knowledge that the Druids once guarded. He represents the wild, untamed wisdom that refused to be fully domesticated by Roman conquest or Christian conversion. He is the whisper of the old ways, amplified and given voice in the grand narrative of Arthur. His very existence within the Arthurian canon is a testament to the persistence of a spiritual outlook that valued intuition, natural law, and the interconnectedness of all things. Think about the settings of the Arthurian legends, the impenetrable forests, the mysterious lakes, the misty moors, the ancient stone circles. These are not merely backdrops. They are active participants in the drama. They are places of power, enchantment, and danger, echoing the sacred nemetons and thin places of Celtic belief. The Lady of the Lake, emerging from the depths to present Excalibur, is a powerful water spirit, a figure deeply resonant with the pre-Christian veneration of water as a source of life, healing, and otherworldly power. Avalon, the mythical island where Arthur is taken to heal, is a clear echo of the Celtic otherworld, a paradise or realm of the blessed, accessible only to a select few, shrouded in mist and mystery. It is not a Christian heaven, but a pagan Elysium, a place outside linear time where magic reigns. The Dark Ages itself, that period of profound historical obscurity, paradoxically created the perfect conditions for these ancient roots to re-emerge and intertwine with new growth. With centralized Roman authority gone, and Christianity still establishing its dominance, local traditions and beliefs, often deeply infused with pre-Christian elements, flourished. The absence of strong, unified governance meant that the spiritual landscape became a patchwork of lingering paganism, nascent Christianity, and a desperate search for meaning and order. It was in this fertile, chaotic ground that the legends of a unifying hero like Arthur could take root and blossom. He emerged not just as a military leader, but as a figure who could bring order to a fractured land, drawing strength from both the emerging Christian ideals of justice and chivalry and the deep, almost subconscious wellspring of ancient British magic and wisdom. The writers and storytellers who shaped these legends were inheritors of a cultural memory that extended back through Roman times, back to the very age of the Druids. They may have been Christian scribes, but their imaginations were populated by the spirits of the land, the magic of the other world, and the archetypal wisdom figures that had existed in Britain for millennia. So the Druidic legacy wasn't erased, it transformed. It went underground, became part of the folklore, the superstition, the unspoken understanding of the world that permeated everyday life. It found new expression through figures like Merlin and places like Avalon. It shaped the very landscape of the imagination that gave birth to King Arthur. The quote 14 in Arthurian legends isn't just arbitrary fantasy. It's a direct, albeit mythologized, descendant of the pre-Christian spiritual understanding of Britain. A world where the sacred was immanent, where trees spoke, and where the veil between worlds was thin enough for heroes to cross. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention more directly to the figure of Arthur himself, exploring how these powerful undercurrents of ancient belief, combined with the desperate realities of Dark Age Britain, coalesced into the legend of the once and future king, and how the echoes of the Druids continued to resonate in his mythical court. We'll explore the historical glimmers of a real Arthur, and how those sparse facts were then embroidered with the rich tapestry of a land still dreaming of its ancient magic. Welcome back, seekers of ancient truths, to our journey through the mists of Britain's past. We've traced the Druids from their revered status as the spiritual backbone of Celtic society to their brutal suppression by Rome, and then witnessed the spiritual vacuum that birthed the legends of King Arthur. We left off with the profound idea that the Druidic legacy wasn't erased but transformed, persisting as an undercurrent in folklore, local customs, and the very imagination that shaped the Arthurian myths. Now, let's pull back the veil a little further and truly understand how such a deeply rooted yet suppressed spiritual tradition could continue to echo through the ages, shaping a nation's foundational narratives. Imagine, if you will, a great river. The Romans, in their zealous pursuit of conquest and order, dammed and diverted its main course. They destroyed its temples, scattered its priesthood, and forbade its rituals. Yet, the river's spirit, its very essence, found new paths. It seeped into the ground, formed hidden springs, and bubbled up in unexpected places, nourishing the land in ways unseen. This is precisely what happened to the Druidic legacy. The formal structure was gone, yes, but the deep-seated reverence for the land, the spirits, the other world, these were not easily eradicated from the collective consciousness of the people. How does a belief system survive when its formal practitioners are silenced and its sacred sites desecrated? It survives through the people themselves. The Druids, remember, relied on a rigorous oral tradition. They wrote nothing down. While this meant their specific teachings were lost to official history, it also meant that the people were the primary vessels of their cultural memory. The stories, the myths, the local legends, the reverence for specific ancient trees, springs, or stones, these were passed down not as druidic lessons, but simply as the way things are, or the old stories. By the hearth fire under the misty mornings or while tending fields, the elders would recount tales that, unbeknownst to them, carried the echoes of an older faith. These weren't explicit sermons on transmigration of souls, but perhaps a warning about disturbing a particular fairy mound, or a tale of a hero who drew power from a sacred well. This folk memory, tenacious and deeply embedded, became the fertile soil in which new legends could take root. And what a fertile soil it was, especially when we look at the very landscape of Arthur's Britain. Think back to the Druids' profound connection to nature, their nemetons, sacred groves, often centred around ancient oaks, natural springs or megalithic sites. They saw divinity in the rustling leaves, the flowing water, the immovable stones. Now, consider the Arthurian world. It is not a landscape of grand Roman basilicas or even nascent Christian cathedrals, but one dominated by enchanted forests, mysterious lakes, hidden caves, and mist-shrouded islands. These are not mere backdrops. They are active, sentient participants in the narrative, imbued with their own magic and power. Take the Lady of the Lake, for instance. She is one of the most iconic figures in Arthurian lore, the enigmatic giver of Excalibur, the sword of power, and later, the one who receives the dying king. Her domain is not a church or a castle, but a mystical body of water. This powerful figure, emerging from the depths of a lake, is a direct echo of ancient Celtic water veneration. For the Druids and the Celts, water sources, springs, rivers, lakes were sacred portals, places of healing, prophecy, and connection to the other world. Offerings were cast into them, and their waters were believed to hold immense power. The Lady of the Lake, a powerful female deity figure residing within a watery realm, represents this ancient reverence, transformed but unmistakably present. She is not a Christian saint, but a primal force, deeply connected to the land's ancient magic. Then there is Avalon, Arthur's final destination, the mythical island where he is taken to be healed after his last battle. Avalon is not the Christian heaven. It is the Celtic otherworld by another name. The otherworld for the Celts was not a place of eternal reward or damnation, but a mystical realm existing parallel to our own, a place of profound magic, healing, and often immortality or eternal youth. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, accessible through specific natural features, mounds, caves, or islands shrouded in mist. Avalon, the Oasis, a place of enchantment and healing, is a direct continuation of this ancient concept. Arthur does not die and ascend to a Christian paradise. He journeys to a sacred island, a liminal space, where he can be healed and perhaps one day return. This cyclical view of life, death, and rebirth, rather than a linear journey to an afterlife, resonates deeply with the druidic belief in the transmigration of souls. And what about Merlin? We've touched upon him as the last druid, but let's truly unpack what that means. Merlin is Arthur's guide, teacher, philosopher, and political advisor, roles that precisely mirror the multifaceted functions of the Druids in Celtic society. His magic is not that of Christian miracles, which often rely on divine intervention and moral rectitude. Instead, Merlin's magic is primal, elemental, and deeply interwoven with the fabric of the natural world. He speaks with animals, foresees futures through natural signs, manipulates the elements, and understands the ancient lore of the land. His power comes from a profound connection to nature, not from a detached deity. His mysterious origins are often depicted as being born of a mortal woman and a spirit or demon, further link him to ancient folklore of half-divine beings, bridging the human and supernatural realms in a way that feels distinctly pre-Christian. He is the bridge between the old ways and the new, attempting to infuse Arthur's burgeoning kingdom with the wisdom and magic of a forgotten era. This brings us to the fascinating phenomenon of syncretism, the blending of different, often contradictory belief systems. As Christianity slowly, painstakingly spread across Britain, it didn't simply eradicate the pagan beliefs. That would have been impossible and ultimately counterproductive. Instead, it often absorbed, reinterpreted, and recontextualized them. Old gods became saints, sacred groves became the sites for new churches, and pagan festivals were cleverly rebranded as Christian holidays. The spirit of the land's sacredness remained, but its label changed. The Holy Grail quest is perhaps the most profound example of this syncretism in the Arthurian narrative. Here we have a deeply Christian artifact, the cup used at the Last Supper, imbued with divine power, yet its quest unfolds in a world teeming with pagan magic. Knights of chivalry, many of whom are far from saintly, embark on a perilous journey through enchanted forests, encounter strange beasts, visit mystical castles, and are guided by figures who often possess ancient wisdom rather than purely theological insight. The quest itself is a journey into the spiritual wild, a test of both faith and valour, but it is undertaken within a landscape and a cultural memory shaped by centuries of druidic reverence for the mystical and the hidden. The Grail, while Christian in origin, becomes the ultimate symbol for a spiritual journey that feels distinctly Celtic in its mystical, experiential nature rather than purely dogmatic. So, in the spiritual vacuum left by the Roman withdrawal, who are the weavers of this new mythos, these tales that blended ancient echoes with burgeoning Christian ideals? In the absence of the formal druidic priesthood, the bards, poets, and chroniclers stepped into the role of cultural memory keepers. These were the storytellers of the post-Roman era, individuals steeped in the oral traditions and cultural memories of their people. They weren't, quote, 20 in any formal sense, but they inherited the mantle of storytelling, of preserving the great deeds of heroes and some profound mysteries of the land. It was these bards who began to formalize the Arthurian cycle, blending heroic tales, local legends, and the nascent Christian ethos into a coherent, compelling narrative. This was an act of both conscious and unconscious cultural preservation, ensuring that the essence of the old ways, however transformed, would not be lost. The enduring appeal of King Arthur even today lies precisely in this rich, complex tapestry. He is not just a Christian king or a historical warlord, he is a figure who embodies the deep, magical connection to the land, the echoes of ancient wisdom, and the enduring hope for unity in desperate times. The druidic legacy, though unseen and unacknowledged by the new order, provided the very soil in which the Arthurian legend could take root and flourish. It offered a profound sense of identity and continuity for a people grappling with profound change, a reminder that even in the darkest ages the spirit of the land and its ancient magic could endure. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention more directly to the historical Arthur, if such a figure truly existed, and explore the very real threats and challenges he would have faced in a Britain still reeling from Roman departure and facing relentless invasion. We'll explore how the legends began to take concrete shape, moving from oral tradition to written word, and how the historical Arthur becomes inextricably linked with the mystical landscape we've just discussed. Welcome back, seekers of ancient wisdom and forgotten histories. We stand now at a fascinating juncture, a point where the echoes of a suppressed past coalesce into the vibrant legends of a nascent future. We've explored the enigmatic Druids, their profound influence, and their tragic suppression. We've witnessed the spiritual vacuum left by Rome's conquest and the subsequent withdrawal, a chaotic period that cried out for a hero. And into that desperate void stepped Arthur, a figure whose very essence, as we've begun to see, seems imbued with the lingering spirit of the very traditions Rome sought to obliterate. If you've been following our journey, you understand that the druidic legacy didn't vanish with the burning of Mona or the razing of their sacred groves. Instead, it went underground, a spiritual aquifer nourishing the cultural landscape. Nowhere is this more vividly personified than in the figure of Merlin, the archetypal wizard, advisor, and mystic of the Arthurian sagas. Think about Merlin for a moment. What images spring to mind? Is it not a man of profound wisdom, often ancient in appearance, deeply connected to the natural world, possessing knowledge that transcends the ordinary? This, we argue, is the most direct and potent manifestation of the druidic spirit within the Arthurian narrative. Merlin, in many ways, is the druid reborn, or at least reimagined for a new age. He embodies the intellectual rigour, the philosophical depth, and the spiritual power that defined the Druids. His counsel to kings, his understanding of the stars, his ability to divine the future, and his mastery over the natural world are all direct reflections of the druidic roles as judges, teachers, astronomers, and seers. Where the Romans branded the Druids as barbaric ritualists, Merlin is revered as a fount of ancient wisdom, a figure of immense authority and respect. He doesn't merely perform parlour tricks. His magic is presented as a profound understanding of the cosmic order, the hidden currents of the earth, and the cycles of life and death, knowledge that aligns perfectly with what we know or surmise about druidic cosmology. He is a bridge, standing with one foot firmly in the pagan, nature-centric past, and the other guiding the Christianizing future of Britain. He is the guardian of the old ways, subtly weaving them into the fabric of the new. Consider his liminal existence, often dwelling in wild places in caves or deep forests, separate yet connected to the centres of power. This mirrors the Druids' own chosen environments, their nemetons, their sacred groves, their retreats from the ordinary world where they communed with the divine. Merlin's power is not derived from books, but from an intuitive, almost primal connection to the land itself, to its ancient stones and flowing waters. He doesn't just know magic, he is magic, an extension of the earth's own mystical pulse. This is a profound departure from the Roman ideal of centralized written law and order. Merlin represents the enduring power of unwritten tradition, of wisdom passed down through intuition and oral transmission, a direct echo of the druidic commitment to memorization over inscription. He teaches Arthur not just strategies of war, but the deeper meaning of kingship, the spiritual responsibility to the land and its people, a concept deeply rooted in Celtic thought, where the health of the king was intrinsically linked to the fertility of the land. The very landscape of Arthur's Britain, too, pulses with this ancient druidic energy. It is not merely a backdrop for heroic deeds, it is a living, breathing character in the drama, imbued with magic and mystery. Think of the enchanted forests like Broceliande, where fey creatures dwell and ancient secrets are guarded. These are not simply woods, they are echoes of the Nemetons, places where the veil between worlds is thin, where spirits reside, and where profound spiritual experiences occur. Imagine the deep, misty valleys, the ancient hills crowned with standing stones, the mysterious lakes from which powerful entities emerge. These are the sacred places of the Celts, locations that retained their spiritual significance long after the formal druidic order was shattered. The land remembers, and its memory becomes the stage for Arthur's destiny. This is particularly evident in the pervasive presence of water in Arthurian legend. The Lady of the Lake, a figure of immense power and mystery, is not merely a fairy tale character. She is a direct descendant of the Celtic veneration of water deities and spirits. For the Druids, springs, rivers, and lakes were conduits to the other world, places of healing, prophecy, and divine power. The Lady of the Lake, with her ability to bestow the magical sword Excalibur upon Arthur, and to reclaim it in his final moments, embodies this ancient reverence. She represents the enduring feminine divine, a force of nature that shapes destiny, a stark contrast to the patriarchal structures of both Roman and early Christian society. Her presence is a powerful reminder that even as Christianity took root, the deep-seated spiritual connection to the natural world persisted, finding new forms of expression within the emerging myths. Then there is Avalon, the mystical island where Arthur goes to heal his wounds and await his return. Avalon is the quintessential Celtic otherworld, a place of peace, magic, and eternal youth, often depicted as a mist-shrouded island of apples. It is a realm beyond the mundane, accessible only to the chosen, a place where the rules of the mortal world do not apply. This concept of the other world, a parallel reality inhabited by gods and spirits, was central to Druidic cosmology and Celtic belief. While later Christian interpretations might try to rationalize Avalon as a sort of monastic retreat, its core identity as a magical otherworldly sanctuary remains powerfully pagan. It's a place where the ancient magic of Britain endures, untouched by conquest or conversion. The very idea of Arthur's return from Avalon speaks to a cyclical view of time and destiny, a concept that resonates with the Druidic belief in the transmigration of souls and the eternal cycle of nature. Even the Holy Grail, that most Christian of artifacts, finds its roots deeply intertwined with Celtic mythology. While the Grail quest is undeniably a Christian allegory of spiritual purity and salvation, its narrative structure, its mystical properties, and even some of its symbolism bear striking resemblances to pre-Christian Celtic tales of sacred cauldrons and magical vessels. These cauldrons, often associated with abundance, healing, and resurrection, were powerful symbols in Celtic lore, linked to the gods and the otherworld. The Grail, therefore, can be seen as a profound example of syncretism, a Christian symbol grafted onto an existing pagan quest framework, drawing its power and allure from the deep, spiritual wellspring of Celtic myth. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the early chroniclers and bards, who, even as they embraced Christianity, could not entirely abandon the rich tapestry of their ancestral stories. They understood that to make the new relatable, it had to speak the language of the old. What we witness in the Arthurian legends, then, is not merely the creation of a hero, but the intricate weaving of a national identity from disparate threads. In a Britain fragmented by invasion, internal strife, and the lingering trauma of Roman withdrawal, these stories provided a desperately needed sense of continuity and hope. They offered a vision of a unified kingdom, led by a righteous king, defended by noble knights, and guided by ancient wisdom. The druidic spiritual aquifer, though unseen, provided the deep, fertile ground for these tales to take root and flourish. The oral traditions, once guarded secrets of the Druids, found new conduits through Christian bards and storytellers who, perhaps unconsciously, preserved and adapted the ancient motifs, symbols, and spiritual understandings. The Druids, in their destruction, paradoxically ensured their immortality within the cultural consciousness. Their disappearance left a void that could only be filled by myth, a myth that, in its very structure and symbolism, paid homage to their enduring influence. Arthur's Britain, with its enchanted forests, its mysterious lakes, its wise old wizards, and its quest for the divine, is a testament to this profound, subtle, and ultimately indomitable legacy. It's a world where the old gods and the new god coexist, where ancient magic still stirs beneath the surface of Christian piety, and where the spirit of the Druids, though silenced, continues to whisper through the ages. This complex interplay between what was lost and what was transformed is what makes the Arthurian legend so rich and compelling. It's why they continue to resonate with us today, speaking to a primal connection to nature, to the search for wisdom, and to the enduring human need for heroes. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the specific individuals who took these potent oral traditions, these whispered tales, and began to commit them to parchment, shaping the Arthurian narrative as we largely know it today. We'll explore the chroniclers and the historical context that finally gave written form to the legends, and how their own biases and beliefs further moulded the legacy of both Arthur and the lingering spirit of the Druids. Welcome back, fellow seekers of ancient truths. We ended our last exploration with a profound question, didn't we? We established that the Druidic legacy, though brutally suppressed, didn't simply vanish. It persisted as a resilient undercurrent, a spiritual aquifer nourishing the cultural landscape. But how, precisely, did this happen? What were the invisible conduits, the subtle mechanisms through which the profound wisdom and spiritual essence of the Druids subtly shaped the nascent Arthurian legends? It's a question that brings us face to face with the incredible tenacity of human belief and the complex interplay of memory, myth, and adaptation. Think about it. An entire intellectual and spiritual class, systematically dismantled, their sacred groves razed, their practices outlawed. Yet, their influence endures for centuries, culminating in the very legends that define Britain's mythological core. This isn't just about a few scattered pagan remnants. It's about the very DNA of a culture, the first and perhaps most potent mechanism of survival was the very thing the Romans sought to destroy: oral tradition. The Druids, as we know, deliberately shunned written records, trusting instead to the prodigious memories of their initiates and the power of spoken word. This wasn't a flaw, it was a strength. While Roman legions could burn libraries and destroy physical artifacts, they could not easily extinguish the stories, the genealogies, the laws, and the spiritual teachings held within the minds of a people. Imagine the mist-shrouded hills of post-Roman Britain, where the official Roman structures have crumbled and the new Christian faith is slowly taking root. In the homes, around the hearth fires, the elders still tell tales. They speak of the old gods, the spirits of the woods and waters, the wisdom of their ancestors. These narratives, passed down through generations, became the secret repositories of druidic thought. They were whispered lessons, cautionary fables, epic poems of heroes and enchantments that, even when stripped of their explicit druidic context, carried the indelible imprint of a worldview deeply connected to nature and the other world. This oral tradition, resilient and adaptable, fed directly into key folk memory and local customs. Consider the sheer ubiquity of certain beliefs and practices that stubbornly refused to die. The veneration of specific trees, particularly the oak, persisted. Sacred springs and wells, once sites of druidic ritual, often became associated with Christian saints, their healing properties attributed to a new divine power, but the underlying reverence for the water itself remained. The turning of the seasons, marked by ancient Celtic festivals like Samhain or Beltane, continued to be celebrated, often simply as communal gatherings, their pagan origins gradually obscured or reinterpreted. If you were a peasant in 5th century Britain, you might not explicitly identify as following druidic practices, but your fear of the forest spirits, your respect for the ancient standing stones, your understanding of the cyclical nature of life and death, these were the echoes of a profound spiritual heritage. These deeply ingrained beliefs formed a bedrock upon which later stories could build, providing a familiar framework of magic, mystery, and connection to the land that made the Arthurian legends so resonant. Then there are the bards and storytellers. These were the professional custodians of memory, the entertainers, and often the chroniclers of their age. Even as Christianity gained ascendancy, many bards, whether pagan or Christian themselves, would have been steeped in the older lore. They were the bridge builders, perhaps unconsciously, between the ancient past and the evolving present. When they sang of heroes and battles, of quests and magical interventions, they drew from a vast reservoir of existing motifs, archetypes, and narrative structures. A bard composing a tale for a chieftain in a dimly lit hall would naturally weave in elements that resonated with his audience's deepest cultural understanding. The powerful enchantress, the wise hermit who dwells in the wilderness, a clear echo of the druid philosopher, the quest for a mystical object, the trials of courage and loyalty. These elements, while perhaps no longer explicitly labelled druidic, were undeniably infused with the spirit of the old ways. They were the filtered memories, the distilled essence of a pagan past, repackaged and represented for a new era. This brings us to the fascinating process of syncretism in action. We touched on it before, but let's delve deeper into how the new Christian faith absorbed and transformed older pagan elements within the Arthurian narrative. Take, for instance, the concept of prophecy. Druids were renowned seers, their pronouncements guiding kings and shaping destinies. In the Arthurian world, this role is powerfully embodied by Merlin. While Merlin's magic might be attributed to demonic parentage in some Christianized accounts, his wisdom, his connection to nature, his ability to see beyond the veil of ordinary perception, and his role as a kingmaker are undeniably reminiscent of the druidic archetype. He is the repository of ancient knowledge, the one who understands the deeper currents of the land and fate. His very existence within the legends ensures that the prophetic, mystical aspect of the druidic worldview remains central. Consider also the sacred geography of Arthurian Britain, the enchanted forests, the mysterious lakes, the mist-shrouded islands like Avalon. These are not merely picturesque backdrops. They are active participants in the narrative, imbued with agency and power. This reflects the druidic understanding of the land itself as sacred, alive with spirits, and possessing its own inherent magic. For the Druids, specific places, the Nemetons, the ancient springs, the stone circles, were thin places where the veil between worlds was permeable. In Arthurian legends, these places become sites of profound encounters, the Lady of the Lake emerging from the water to bestow Excalibur, the perilous journey through the enchanted forest, the final voyage to Avalon. The Christianization of these sites might see a hermitage built near a sacred spring, or a miracle attributed to a saint at a formerly pagan holy place, but the underlying reverence for the place and its inherent power persists. The land remembers, and so do the stories woven around it. Even the complex moral landscape of Arthur's court, with its emphasis on honour, loyalty, and the pursuit of justice, can be seen as having echoes of druidic societal structures. The Druids were judges, arbitrators, and guardians of law and custom. While Arthur's chivalric code is undoubtedly shaped by Christian ideals, the foundational understanding of a just society, of a king advised by wise counsel, and of a system of justice that binds the community, resonates with the societal role of the Druids in pre-Roman Celtic society. The very idea of a round table where all are equal in council subtly reinforces a sense of communal decision-making that might have been lost in more autocratic systems, and perhaps harks back to councils led by respected Druids. The genius of the Arthurian legends, then, lies in their capacity to become a grand tapestry woven from these diverse threads. They absorbed the shock of Roman conquest, the chaos of the Dark Ages, and the transformative power of Christianity, yet they never entirely severed their roots from the ancient soil. The Druidic Quote 24 continued to flow, not as a roaring river on the surface, but as a deep hidden current, subtly shaping the contours of the landscape above. It provided the deep cultural grammar, the underlying narrative logic that made sense of the world for the people of Britain. Merlin, perhaps more than any other figure, embodies this fusion. He is the last great echo of the Druidic past, a figure who transcends the boundaries of time and belief. He is the wild, untamed wisdom of the old ways, serving the new Christian king, Arthur. His magic is rooted in the earth, his prophecies in the stars, and his counsel in the ancient knowledge of Britain. He is the living proof that the Druidic spirit, though transformed, was never truly conquered. He is the mechanism by which the ancient past directly informs the legendary present, ensuring that Arthur's Britain, for all its Christian overlay, remains profoundly enchanted, profoundly mysterious, and profoundly connected to the spiritual legacy of its pre-Roman inhabitants. The Arthurian legends, therefore, are not merely tales of knights and quests. They are a testament to the enduring power of a people's spiritual identity. They demonstrate that while institutions can be dismantled and beliefs suppressed, the fundamental ways in which a culture understands the universe, its relationship with nature, and its sense of the sacred can persist, adapting and evolving across centuries. This makes the legends not just fascinating stories, but invaluable cultural artifacts, offering us glimpses into a lost world through the lens of a new one. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention more directly to the figure of King Arthur himself. We'll explore the historical quest for a quote 25 Arthur, weigh the evidence, and ultimately consider why the legend, regardless of its historical veracity, became such a potent and enduring force for the people of Britain. Join us as we sift through the mists of time to understand the man behind the myth, or perhaps the myth behind the man. Welcome back, fellow travellers, on this winding path through history and legend. In our last chapter, we ventured into the twilight of pagan Britain, observing how the spiritual aquifer of druidic influence continued to flow, subtly shaping the nascent Arthurian legends through oral traditions, folk memory, and the bards. Now, we turn a crucial page in our narrative, embarking on the very quote 26, a journey not just through chaotic post-Roman Britain, but through the treacherous landscape of fragmented evidence and evolving storytelling. We're going to explore how these vibrant living oral traditions finally began their challenging, often contentious transition into the written word. Imagine, if you will, Britain in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. The Romans are gone, their legions withdrawn, their administrative structure crumbling. What remains is a patchwork of emergent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the east and south, clashing fiercely with the native Romano-British in the west. This is a land of mist and memory, of desperate battles and fleeting victories. It's also a period we often call the Dark Ages, not because nothing happened, but because our sources are so incredibly scarce, like trying to reconstruct an entire tapestry from a few frayed threads. Think about this. If you were trying to find a historical Arthur, a real person who led men in battle, a dux bellorum or war leader, where would you look? You'd crave contemporary accounts, wouldn't you? Eyewitness testimonies, official records. But for this period, such luxuries simply don't exist. What we have instead are later compilations, moralizing sermons, and annals, often written centuries after the events they purport to describe. This is the ultimate paradox of the historical Arthur. The closer we get to his supposed time, the less evidence we find. Our first and arguably most important near-contemporary source is the British monk Gildas, writing in the mid-6th century CE, perhaps around 540. His work, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, is not a history book in the modern sense. It's a fiery Jeremiad, a scathing sermon denouncing the sins of the British kings and clergy, whom Gildas blames for the Anglo-Saxon conquests. He provides a vivid, if biased, picture of a land in turmoil, ravaged by plague and warfare. He describes a great victory for the Britons at the Battle of Baden Hill, which temporarily halted the Saxon advance, and he even names a prominent British leader, Ambrosius Aurelianus. Here's the crucial point, the historical paradox that has fueled endless debate. Gildas, writing within a generation or two of Arthur's supposed floruit, does not mention Arthur. Not once. He details the Battle of Baden, but he doesn't attribute it to a figure named Arthur. This silence is deafening for those seeking a purely historical Arthur. Does it mean Arthur didn't exist? Or does it mean that if he did, he wasn't yet the legendary figure we would come to know? Perhaps a regional leader whose fame hadn't reached Gildas, or whose exploits Gilda simply chose to omit for his own rhetorical purposes. It's a question that continues to haunt us. Fast forward a couple of centuries and we encounter Nennius, a Welsh cleric generally credited with compiling the Historia Brittonum, History of the Britons, around 830 CE. This is where Arthur makes his grand entrance into the written record. Nennius's work is a fascinating, if sometimes muddled, collection of genealogies, legends and historical snippets drawn from various sources. He presents Arthur not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a military commander who led the British kings into battle. Nennius famously lists 12 battles fought by Arthur, culminating once again in the victory at Baden Hill, where Arthur is said to have personally slain 960 men. This is a pivotal moment. For the first time, a written text explicitly names Arthur as the hero of Baden and details his military prowess. But how much of Nennius's account is historical fact, and how much is the crystallization of centuries of oral tradition, embellished and amplified? Nennius himself admits he's compiling from various sources, and the Historia Brittonum is less a rigorous historical narrative and more a patriotic attempt to provide the Welsh with a glorious past. Yet, it offers the first tangible anchor for Arthur in the written world, lifting him from the realm of pure conjecture, even if still shrouded in the mists of legend. Adding another layer to our understanding are the Iam Annales Cambriae, Welsh Annals, a collection of brief, laconic entries compiled in the 10th century, though likely based on earlier records. These annals provide two tantalizing entries, one noting the Battle of Baden and stating, Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victors, and another dated 537 CE, recording the strife of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medraut perished. These entries are incredibly brief, almost cryptic, but they reinforce Arthur's association with two of the most iconic events in his legend, his greatest victory and his tragic downfall. They also hint at a Christian dimension, a feature that would become increasingly important in later retellings. So, by the 10th century, we have a shadowy figure named Arthur, a British war leader, associated with a great victory at Baden and a fatal battle at Camelot, mentioned in a few sparse written accounts. But these are fragments. They suggest a historical kernel, perhaps, but they don't give us the King Arthur we know. For that, we need to acknowledge the immense power of the oral tradition, that spiritual aquifer we discussed earlier. For centuries, these stories of heroes, battles, magic, and ancient gods were not confined to dusty scrolls. They lived on the lips of bards and storytellers, passed down through generations, evolving with each telling. This was the true repository of the druidic legacy, transformed and adapted, yet still imbued with the spirit of the land and its ancient magic. Then, in the 12th century, everything changed. Enter Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around 1136 CE, Geoffrey, a cleric from Wales, unleashed his monumental work upon the world, Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain. This book was, to put it mildly, a sensation, and it is arguably the single most important text in the entire Arthurian tradition, the moment when the oral traditions and fragmented written accounts truly coalesced and exploded into the legend we recognize today. Geoffrey's Historia is a brilliant, audacious, and utterly transformative piece of work. He claims to have translated and quoted a claim that has been widely dismissed by modern scholars. In reality, Geoffrey took the sparse mentions of Arthur from Nennius and the Annales Cambriae, combined them with Welsh legends, folklore, and his own fertile imagination, and spun an entire epic narrative. He essentially invented the King Arthur that would capture the imagination of Europe. Think about the elements we now consider fundamental to the Arthurian legend: Merlin the wizard, the sword Excalibur, Arthur's queen Guinevere, the treacherous Mordred, the noble Lancelot, the castle Camelot, and the mystical island of Avalon. While some of these elements might have existed in nascent forms in oral traditions, it was Geoffrey who brought them together, gave them coherent shape, and wove them into a grand, sweeping narrative of Britain's glorious past. He transformed Arthur from a regional war leader into a mighty king, an emperor who conquered much of Europe, establishing a court of unparalleled chivalry and justice. Geoffrey's motivations were complex. He clearly wanted to provide Britain with a national epic, a history as grand and ancient as those of Rome or France. He aimed to entertain, and he succeeded spectacularly. But in doing so, he blurred the lines between history and fiction so thoroughly that they have never truly separated. His Historia was presented as fact, and for centuries many believed it to be so. It was a masterstroke of historical fiction, long before the term existed. The impact was immediate and profound. Geoffrey's Latin text was quickly translated and adapted. Wace, a Norman poet writing in French verse around 1155, introduced the concept of the Round Table, la table ronde, and further popularized the tales. Later, Laemon, an English priest writing in Middle English around 1200, added even more detail and localized flavor, bringing Arthurian legend directly into the English language. This was the critical moment. The commitment of these stories to the written form, especially in a comprehensive, engaging narrative like Geoffrey's, ensured their survival and dissemination far beyond the confines of local oral traditions. The spiritual aquifer of ancient Celtic and druidic influence, which had flowed through generations of bards and storytellers, now burst forth into the mainstream of medieval European literature. The written word, ironically, gave immortality to a figure whose very existence was rooted in a culture that shunned writing. It solidified the blend of the ancient and the new, the pagan and the Christian, the historical and the mythical, creating a foundational legend for a nascent nation. The quest for Arthur, therefore, shifts dramatically with Geoffrey. It's no longer just a search for a historical warlord in the Dark Ages. It becomes a quest to understand the enduring power of myth, the way stories shape identity, and how a suppressed spiritual heritage can re-emerge, transformed to inspire generations. The written word didn't just record Arthur, it created him, ensuring that his legend would continue to evolve, reflecting the changing values and aspirations of the societies that embraced him. In our next chapter, we will delve deeper into the medieval blossoming of Arthurian legend, exploring how the tales evolved further, how the concepts of chivalry and courtly love became intertwined with Arthur's court, and how these stories continued to reflect and shape the very idea of Britain itself. We'll explore the rich tapestry woven by poets and romancers, forever indebted to the audacious vision of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and the ancient echoes of the Druids. We left our exploration tracing the first hesitant steps of Arthur's legend, from the mists of oral tradition into the emerging light of written history. Nennius, in the 9th century, gave us a list of battles and the title Dux Bellorum, a war leader. The Annales Cambriae, in the 10th, offered brief, tantalizing mentions of Baden and Camlan. But these were mere brushstrokes on a vast empty canvas. The true architect, the one who would lay the foundational stones and raise the towering spires of the Arthurian myth as we largely recognise it today, was a 12th century cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Imagine, if you will, the intellectual landscape of 12th century Britain. The Norman conquest was a century past, but the cultural fabric was still a complex weave of Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman threads. There was a burgeoning sense of national identity, a hunger for origin stories, for heroes who could give a new people a shared past, a glorious lineage stretching back into antiquity. Into this fertile ground, Geoffrey of Monmouth planted his literary seed, the Historia Regum Britannia. The history of the kings of Britain, penned around 1136. Geoffrey claimed to be translating an ancient lost Welsh book, a convenient narrative device that allowed him immense creative freedom while lending his work an air of historical legitimacy. And what a creation it was. His Historia wasn't just a chronicle, it was an epic, a grand narrative that took the sparse mentions of Arthur and exploded them into a full-fledged, captivating saga. He didn't merely flesh out a warrior, he invented a king, an emperor, a figure of unparalleled majesty and might. Think about the sheer audacity and genius of it. It is Geoffrey who gives us Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, and the miraculous magical circumstances of Arthur's conception, aided by the enigmatic figure who would become almost as famous as Arthur himself, Merlin. Merlin. Here in Geoffrey's pages we find the quintessential embodiment of that enduring druidic spiritual aquifer we've discussed. Merlin isn't just a wise man, he is a prophet, a shapeshifter, a master of arcane knowledge deeply connected to the ancient mystical forces of Britain. He foretells Arthur's destiny, orchestrates his birth, and advises him, acting as a bridge between the deep pagan past and the nascent Christian-tinged chivalry of Arthur's court. He is the last great druid, cloaked in the susses of a wizard, his magic a direct echo of the lost wisdom of the Nemetons. Geoffrey also introduced or significantly elaborated on so many of the iconic elements that are now inseparable from the legend: the sword Caliburnus, later Excalibur, the grand court at Camelot, though the name itself would evolve, the Queen Guinevere, the treacherous Mordred, and the mystical island of Avalon, that otherworldly paradise where Arthur is taken after his final battle, a clear echo of the Celtic otherworld and the druidic belief in transmigration. He painted Arthur not just as a local warlord, but as a conqueror who extended his empire across Britain, Gaul, and even challenged Rome itself. It was a story of a golden age, a peak of British power and glory, tragically lost but forever remembered. The Historia Regum Britannia was an instant sensation. It was copied, circulated, and devoured by an eager audience across Europe. It provided a powerful, romantic vision of British history, fulfilling that deep-seated need for heroic ancestry. While scholars of the time often debated its veracity, and modern historians certainly do, its impact was undeniable. Geoffrey wasn't just writing history. He was forging a new mythology, one that would resonate for centuries. He transformed Arthur from a historical enigma into a cultural icon, and in doing so, he launched what would become known as the Quote 34, a vast literary cycle centred on King Arthur and his knights. But Geoffrey's Latin prose, while influential, was not the final word. The stories, once unleashed, began to take on a life of their own, evolving and adapting as they moved through different languages, cultures, and literary forms. The next crucial step in this evolution came with the Anglo-Norman poet Wace. Around 1155, Wace took Geoffrey's Latin Historia and translated it into Old French verse, creating his Roman de Brut. This was a monumental shift. By moving the narrative into the vernacular, Wace made the Arthurian tales accessible to a wider aristocratic audience, particularly within the Anglo-Norman courts. Wace not only translated but also embellished, adding his own flourishes to the burgeoning legend. It is often Wace who is credited with introducing the concept of the round table, la table ronde, by name, emphasizing the equality and camaraderie among Arthur's knights. This detail, seemingly small, was profoundly significant. It transformed Arthur's court from a mere gathering of warriors into a symbol of chivalric ideals, brotherhood, and a specific code of conduct that would become central to the later romances. He deepened the descriptions, enriched the characterizations, and infused the narrative with the burgeoning spirit of courtly romance that was sweeping through European literature. Following Wace, we see the legend make its way back across the English Channel and into the English language itself. Around 1190 to 1215, Layamon, an English priest, penned his own Brut, a colossal work of over 16,000 lines of alliterative Middle English verse. Layamon drew heavily on Wace, but his work marked the first extensive English language treatment of the Arthurian story, bringing it to a native English audience and further embedding it within the nascent English literary tradition. His powerful, evocative verse gave the stories a distinctly English voice, adding a raw, heroic energy that resonated with the Anglo-Saxon poetic traditions. But the Arthurian legend wasn't content to remain solely a chronicle of kings and battles. It yearned for more, for individual quests, for the complexities of human emotion, for the ideals of chivalry and courtly love. This is where the brilliant French poet Chrétien de Troyes enters the scene in the late 12th century. Chrétien, writing in Old French verse, revolutionized the Arthurian narrative by shifting the focus from Arthur himself to his individual knights. He introduced or significantly developed characters like Lancelot, Percival, Yvonne, and Gawain, sending them on their own perilous quests for honour, love, and spiritual enlightenment. Chrétien's romances are where we truly see the emergence of courtly love as a central theme, the intricate dance between knightly valour and romantic devotion. He gave us the definitive character of Lancelot, the greatest knight, whose tragic love affair with Queen Guinevere would ultimately lead to the downfall of Camelot. And it is in Chrétien's Percival, the story of the Grail, that we encounter the first literary appearance of the Holy Grail, albeit in a mysterious, undeveloped form. This introduction of the Grail, a sacred, enigmatic object, subtly reconnected the Arthurian world to that deeper spiritual longing, that sense of a quest for something beyond the mundane, echoing the ancient Celtic quests for magical cauldrons or otherworld treasures, a beautiful example of syncretism at play. The sheer popularity of these tales led to an explosion of Arthurian literature. In the early 13th century, a massive anonymous prose cycle, known as the Vulgate cycle or Lancelot Grail cycle, emerged in Old French. This was an ambitious undertaking, an attempt to weave together all the disparate threads of the Arthurian narrative into a comprehensive, continuous saga. The Vulgate cycle significantly expanded on Chrétien's themes, fully integrating the Holy Grail as a Christian symbol of spiritual purity and giving it a definitive quest narrative. It cemented the tragic love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, and laid out the full, devastating sequence of events that led to Camelot's collapse. It was in this cycle that the ideal of Arthur's kingdom reached its zenith, only to be tragically shattered by human failing, treachery, and the inexorable pull of fate. All these streams, all these narratives, all these embellishments eventually converged in the late 15th century with Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. Published posthumously in 1485 by William Caxton, England's first printer, Malory's work was a masterful compilation and reinterpretation of earlier French and English sources. Writing in Middle English prose, Malory synthesized the vast, sprawling Arthurian tradition into a single, cohesive, and deeply moving narrative. Le Morte d'Arthur became the canonical English version of the legend, the text that would shape how generations of readers understood King Arthur and his court. Malory's work is imbued with a profound sense of nostalgia for a lost golden age, a lament for the passing of chivalry and the inevitable decay of even the noblest of human endeavours. He presents Arthur's reign as a glorious yet ultimately tragic arc, the rise of a legendary king, the establishment of a perfect society, and its eventual heartbreaking dissolution due to internal strife, betrayal, and the very human flaws of its heroes. The mist that descends upon Arthur's departure to Avalon in Malory's telling feels like a final curtain call, not just for the king, but for an entire era of magic and myth, a poignant echo of the way the ancient druidic world faded into the shadows. What becomes clear as we trace this literary lineage is that Arthur, the historical figure, whatever his reality, was almost entirely subsumed by Arthur, the legend. From Geoffrey of Monmouth onward, authors were not concerned with historical accuracy in the modern sense. They were myth-makers, storytellers, shaping a narrative that spoke to the deepest desires and anxieties of their age. They created a hero, a kingdom, and a set of ideals that transcended mere historical fact, becoming a powerful cultural touchstone. And through it all, even as the explicit paganism of the Druids was replaced by Christian motifs and chivalric codes, the spirit of that ancient world persisted. Merlin, the mystical landscape, the quest for the sacred, the connection to another world. These elements, woven into the very fabric of the Arthurian tales, served as a testament to the enduring power of Britain's pre-Christian spiritual heritage. The Druids may have been suppressed, their traditions driven underground, but their profound connection to the land, to magic, and to the unseen forces of the cosmos continued to flow like a subterranean river, nourishing the imaginative landscape that King Arthur would come to embody. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the enduring legacy of these legends, exploring how they have been reinterpreted and reimagined across the centuries, and what they continue to tell us about ourselves and our desire for heroes and magic in a world increasingly devoid of both. Welcome back, fellow travellers, on this intricate journey through time and legend. We've explored the paradox of the Druids, their immense power, their brutal suppression, and the subsequent emergence of King Arthur as a figure embodying Britain's desperate need for a hero. We've seen how the Arthurian cycle, far from being a purely Christian narrative, became a vibrant tapestry woven with threads of ancient pagan belief, a subtle yet profound syncretism that allowed the spirit of the Druids to persist. Now, let's delve deeper into how this spiritual aquifer, as we've called it, continued to nourish the imaginative landscape of Britain, not merely as a passive reservoir, but as an active, shaping force within the very fabric of the Arthurian myth. Imagine, if you will, the Roman legions departing Britain in 410 CE, leaving behind a land scarred by conquest, but also imbued with a deep ancestral memory. The formal institutions of Druidism were shattered, their sacred groves desecrated, their practices driven underground. Yet, ideas, beliefs, and a profound connection to the land are not so easily eradicated by the sword. They seep into the soil, into the very stones, carried on the wind, whispered in the folk tales that persist across generations. This, then, is the crucible in which the Arthurian legends truly began to forge their enduring power. A desperate need for identity in a fragmented world, coupled with an indelible spiritual heritage that refused to be silenced. The Arthurian myth, in this light, is not just a story about a king. It is a story of the land itself, a narrative that allowed the suppressed wisdom of the Druids to find a new voice, albeit one often cloaked in Christian allegory. Think about it. How do you preserve the essence of a culture that has been systematically dismantled? You embed it in your heroes, in your landscapes, in the very quests you undertake. And nowhere is this more evident, more potent, than in the figure of Merlin. Merlin, as we've touched upon, is the quintessential echo of a druid, the bridge between the ancient pagan past and Arthur's emerging Christian kingdom. He is not merely a sorcerer, he is the embodiment of archaic wisdom, a prophet whose vision extends beyond the mundane, a counsellor whose advice is rooted in a profound understanding of nature, the cosmos, and the delicate balance of worlds. When we encounter Merlin, we are encountering a figure who, despite being placed within a Christian narrative, operates by an entirely different set of rules, drawing his power from sources that predate the cross. He is the guardian of the old ways, the keeper of secrets that resonate with the druidic reverence for the earth and its hidden energies. Consider his origins, often shrouded in mystery, sometimes even suggesting a non-human or elemental parentage. This immediately sets him apart from the human realm, placing him closer to the divine or the fae, much like the revered Druids who were seen as intermediaries between mortals and the gods. His connection to animals, his ability to shape-shift, his deep knowledge of herbs and healing, his prophetic visions, these are not just magical parlour tricks. They are the hallmarks of a man deeply attuned to the natural world, a master of what the Druids called Olwen, the divine inspiration or flowing spirit. He is the one who understands the language of the stones, the whisper of the trees, the currents of magic that flow beneath the earth. He advises Arthur not just on strategy, but on the spiritual health of the kingdom, reminding us of the Druids' role as political and spiritual advisors to Celtic chieftains. Merlin, in essence, is the voice of the ancient land, speaking through the chaos of the Dark Ages. He guides Arthur, not towards an abandonment of the old ways, but towards an integration, a recognition that true kingship must honour the deep spiritual roots of the land. He is the wise elder, the teacher, the philosopher, the judge, all roles once held by the Druids. His presence in the Arthurian narrative ensures that the memory of that ancient wisdom, though never explicitly named, quote 35, quote, is undeniably present, shaping the very destiny of Britain's greatest king. But it's not just Merlin who carries this torch. The very landscape of Arthurian Britain is saturated with a spiritual resonance that speaks volumes about its druidic past. Think of the enchanted forests, like Brocéliande or the Forest Sauvage, where magic is palpable, where strange encounters occur, and where the veil between worlds seems thin. These are not merely settings, they are characters in themselves, echoing the sacred nemetons, the oak groves where druidic rites were performed. These forests are wild, untamed, and hold ancient power, a stark contrast to the ordered, cultivated lands favoured by Roman civilization. They represent the untamed spirit of Britain, a place where the old gods still linger, where the earth itself is alive with magic. And what of the mysterious lakes, from which Excalibur emerges, or where the Lady of the Lake resides? Water in Celtic belief was a profoundly sacred element, a source of life, healing, and a gateway to the otherworld. Offerings were thrown into bogs and rivers, sacred springs were revered. The Lady of the Lake, a powerful, enigmatic female figure, is a clear descendant of pre-Christian goddesses and water spirits, guardians of liminal spaces and possessors of potent magic. Her role in bestowing Excalibur upon Arthur is a powerful act of validation, connecting his reign not just to divine right, but to the ancient, elemental power of the land itself, a power that the Druids understood and venerated. Then there is Avalon, the mystical island often described as a place of healing, rest, and magic. Where Arthur is taken after his final battle, Avalon is the ultimate Arthurian otherworld, a direct literary descendant of the Celtic otherworld, a timeless realm beyond the mortal plane, accessible only through specific, often magical means. It is a place of perpetual spring, of apple trees, apples being a sacred fruit in Celtic lore, and a sanctuary for ancient wisdom. This concept of a separate magical realm, where heroes go to heal or await their return, is deeply rooted in Celtic cosmology and provides a profound echo of the druidic belief in the transmigration of souls and the existence of realms beyond the immediate physical world. It ensures that even in death, Arthur remains connected to the ancient magical essence of Britain, rather than simply ascending to a Christian heaven. The Arthurian quests themselves, particularly the search for the Holy Grail, can be reinterpreted through this lens of lost druidic wisdom. While the Grail is undeniably a Christian symbol of spiritual purity and divine grace, its origins in the Arthurian cycle, as introduced by Chrétien de Troyes, often hint at something older, something more mysterious than a simple chalice. Think of the magical cauldrons of Celtic myth, cauldrons of plenty, of rebirth, of inspiration. The quest for the Grail, in this broader context, can be seen as a yearning for a lost spiritual understanding, a search for the fragmented truth that was once held whole by the Druids. It's a quest for wholeness, for healing, for a reconnection to a sacred power that has been fractured and scattered. The knights, in their pursuit, are not just seeking Christian salvation. They are, perhaps unknowingly, seeking to re-establish a spiritual equilibrium that was disrupted centuries before. How did these echoes persist? Despite the Roman suppression and the rise of Christianity, the Druidic spirit survived through the tenacious grip of oral tradition and folk memory. The Druids, after all, relied entirely on the spoken word, eschewing written records to guard their knowledge. This very tradition, designed to protect their secrets, ironically ensured that when their formal structures collapsed, their essence could still flow through the informal channels of story, song, and local custom. Bards, poets, and storytellers, the direct inheritors of the Druidic emphasis on memory and narrative, continued to weave tales that, though no longer explicitly Druidic, carried within them the rhythms, symbols, and spiritual understandings of the ancient past. These were the, quote, 36, quote, the subtle influences that shaped the nascent Arthurian legends. A reverence for sacred trees might become an enchanted forest. A powerful female deity might become a lady of the lake. The transmigration of souls might become the promise of Arthur's return from Avalon. This wasn't a conscious effort to preserve Druidism, but rather an organic process of cultural syncretism, where deeply ingrained beliefs and narratives found new forms of expression within an evolving spiritual landscape. The Arthurian legends, born from this fertile ground, became the new vessels for Britain's profound, pre-Christian spiritual heritage. The genius of the Arthurian myth, therefore, lies in its ability to simultaneously embrace the new Christian faith, while subtly honouring the ancient pagan soul of Britain. It created a foundational myth that allowed a people to reconcile their complex past with their evolving present, offering a vision of unity and purpose in an age of profound fragmentation. Arthur, whether a historical figure or not, became more than a king. He became the embodiment of Britain's enduring spirit, a spirit that drew its strength from the deep wells of Druidic wisdom and its hope from the promise of Christian redemption. This intricate weaving of pagan echoes and Christian ideals created a rich, enduring narrative that continues to define British cultural identity, a testament to the fact that true spiritual legacies are rarely extinguished, only transformed. They adapt, they evolve, they find new champions and new stories through which to live. The Druids may have vanished from history's written page, but their spirit, like an underground river, continued to flow, emerging in the most unexpected and powerful ways, shaping the very legends that define Britain's heroic age. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the fascinating and often frustrating quest for the historical Arthur himself. We'll explore the tantalizing clues, the archaeological whispers, and the scholarly debates that continue to surround this enigmatic king, and consider how the myth itself has sometimes obscured, rather than revealed, the man behind the legend. Join us as we sift through the mists of time, seeking the elusive truth of Britain's greatest hero.